At the prestigious Maplewood Academy, power spoke louder than truth. When a black student was wrongly accused, the principal thought she could silence his voice with a simple suspension. But what she didn't know is that the boy's father kept a letter capable of changing everything. Before discovering this twist of justice and redemption, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Because here, karma always finds the path to truth. The morning was cold and silent in Maplewood Academy, a private school known for both its excellence and its rigidity. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and freshly brewed coffee, and the students' voices echoed off the white walls. Amidst that scene of impeccable routine, Malcolm Davis, a 16-year-old boy, hurried to history class. He was punctual, dedicated, and always polite. The son of a respected lawyer in the city, he learned early on that to be heard, he needed to be twice as good as everyone else. But that morning, fate had set a trap. When Malcolm entered the room, he realized something was wrong. The teacher, Mr. Adams, was holding an envelope, and all eyes were on him. "Malcolm," the teacher said seriously, "the principal wants to speak with you. Now." A murmur spread. Malcolm frowned in confusion. "With me? What happened?" The teacher just looked away. "She will explain." The boy walked through the halls in silence, his heart racing. He had never been punished, much less summoned to the principal's office. When he reached the door, he took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," replied a cold voice. A director, Helen Whitford, a middle-aged woman with gray hair tied in a perfect bun, looked up from her papers. Her gaze was hard, almost cutting. "Malcolm Davis," he said, unsmiling. "Sit down." He obeyed, confused. "Madam, I don't understand. What happened?" She placed a cell phone on the table. On the screen, a video recording played. Malcolm recognized the setting, the schoolyard, and what he saw left him speechless. In the video, a white boy, Ethan Miller, was on the ground, his uniform dirty, and someone off-screen appeared to be pushing him. The footage was shaky, taken from a distance. "We received this morning," the principal said. "The video has been circulating in school groups, and everyone claims you're the one who pushed him." Malcolm's eyes widened. "But that's not true. I wasn't even in the courtyard at that time." "So you're saying it's a coincidence that the person in the video has the same backpack, the same uniform, and the same haircut as you?" "With all due respect, ma'am, the recording is blurry. That doesn't prove anything." The director crossed her arms impatiently. "Student Ethan and 2 witnesses confirmed it. Until proven otherwise, you will be suspended for physical assault." The word suspended sounded like a punch. Malcolm tried to argue, but she cut him off. "There's no point in denying it. You've always been a good student, but perhaps you're showing your true colors now." Those last words cut deep. "Who really is?" Malcolm caught the tone. Her suspicion wasn't coming from the video, it was what it represented. With teary eyes, he slowly stood up. "Can I call my dad?" The director nodded coldly. "Sure, but I doubt he can change the school rules." He left the room without saying anything. Outside, he heard murmurs. Several students were looking at him, some whispering. The news had already spread. In the courtyard, Ethan Miller, the boy in the video, was surrounded by friends. He was laughing loudly, delighted. When he saw Malcolm pass by, he gave him a provocative look. "Hey, Davis, are you going to push anyone else today?" Malcolm ignored him, but his blood was boiling. He wanted to scream, wanted to prove his innocence, but he knew any reaction would only make things worse. When he got home, he told his father everything. Robert Davis, a calm lawyer with a firm voice and a look that rarely expressed anger. But that day, something changed in his expression. "Did they accuse you without clear evidence?" "Yes, Dad. And the principal?" She wouldn't even listen. Robert took a deep breath. "So tomorrow, son, you won't go alone." Malcolm nodded, and his father placed a hand on his shoulder. "The world will try to make you doubt who you are, but the truth always finds its way, and we will make sure it finds its way." Night fell over the city, and Maplewood's illuminated facade looked colder than ever. In Awiyanch, that school with its perfect facade, Prejudice had just found a new target, and karma was just beginning to write his answer. The next morning, the sky was gray over Maplewood Academy. A cold wind blew through the flags in the courtyard, and students huddled in groups, discussing the incident. The name Malcolm Davis, it was already the talk of the town in every hallway. Every mouth added a new detail. Every look cast judgment. Meanwhile, inside the black car parked in front of the school, Robert Davis watched the main entrance with a serious expression. He wore a dark suit, but what really caught the eye was his gaze, steady, unwavering. Beside him, Malcolm kept his hands clasped, his expression tense. "Son," the father said quietly, "we're not going to fight today. We're just going to show the truth. What sets you apart from the people who accuse you is that you don't have to shout to be heard." Malcolm took a deep breath and nodded. When they entered the school, eyes immediately turned. Some students whispered, others looked away. The hallway seemed longer than usual, and the sound of their footsteps echoed like a slow drum. When they reached the principal's office, the secretary tried to stop Robert, but he only showed a gold lawyer's badge. "I am here as my son's legal representative," he said firmly, "and I want everything said in this meeting to be in writing." The woman hesitated, but didn't have the courage to argue. He opened the door, and Director Helen greeted them with a fake smile. "Mr. Davis, there was no need for this. It's just a disciplinary procedure. A procedure without concrete evidence is injustice disguised as protocol," he replied as he sat down. The director tried to maintain control of the situation. "We have a video, Mr. Davis, and witnesses who confirmed the assault." Robert clasped his hands together and looked at her calmly. "Then allow me to watch the original video, not a copy made by a group of students. I have the right to verify the authenticity of the evidence." Helen was taken aback, but called her assistant to show her the video. The image, shot from a distance, was shaky and blurry. The alleged attacker's face was barely distinguishable. Robert watched intently, silently. When the video ended, he simply said, "Principal, this isn't proof, it's an assumption, and you've built an entire accusation on assumptions." She crossed her arms, uncomfortable. "Mr. Davis, perhaps you do not understand what it means to maintain order in an institution." Robert smiled slightly. "Oh, I understand perfectly. But I also understand what institutional discrimination is. Because if this kid here were white, you would have waited for an investigation before suspending him." The room fell silent immediately. The principal turned pale. "I don't tolerate that kind of insinuation." "It's not an insinuation," he replied, his voice low but sharp. "It's an observation." Malcolm watched him silently, his chest tight between pride and fear. Robert took a folder from his briefcase and opened it on the table. "Here are the footage from the parking lot cameras, obtained by me through a formal request. They show exactly where my son was at the time of the incident. He wasn't in the parking lot. He was helping the IT technician with a network issue." The director's eyes widened. "That's impossible. Do you want to see?" He placed his laptop on the table and played the video. The image clearly showed Malcolm in another building, meters away from the scene of the alleged shove. Helen tried to react. "But the students said—" Robert interrupted her. "Did the students say what they saw or what they wanted to believe?" The principal fell silent. Malcolm's breathing quickened. His heart pounded. For the first time since the beginning, he felt justice approaching. Robert then stood up and said in a calm but firm tone, "My wife and I taught our son to respect the rules, but we also taught him to never remain silent in the face of injustice. You failed, Principal. Not just him, but all the students who have now learned that skin color can carry more weight than truth." Helen didn't answer. The weight of the words hung in the air like an invisible sentence. After a few seconds, she just murmured, "I will lift the suspension and reopen the investigation." Robert nodded, but before he left, he looked directly into her eyes. "I appreciate it, but don't just remove the punishment, Principal. Remove the prejudice from the position you hold. Because what my son suffered isn't a mistake. It's a reflection." The door closed, and the silence in the hallway seemed different. Malcolm walked beside his father, his heart light for the first time in days. Dad, thank you. Robert smiled. Don't thank me, son. Just promise me one thing. What? That when it's your turn to see injustice, you won't keep quiet either. Malcolm nodded. Outside, the cold wind had died down. The school flag fluttered, but now, somehow, it seemed less imposing, as if even she understood that something important had changed that day. The news spread faster than any official announcement. Within hours, the entire Maplewood Academy knew Malcolm Davis was innocent. The incriminating video had been debunked, and Principal Helen Whitford, who had previously walked the halls with her head held high, now avoided glances. But, as fate often does, the real showdown was yet to come, and it would be in front of everyone. The next morning, the entire school was called to an assembly in the main auditorium. The announcement said the meeting would be about values and respect, but everyone knew the real reason. Students whispered, teachers exchanged glances, and the air was heavy. Malcolm sat in the second-to-last row, trying to remain invisible. With each muffled laugh, he felt his body stiffen. The injustice had been righted, but the scars were still there, in the suspicious glances, in the whispered conversations. Beside him, his friend Jamal, who had always supported him, said, "Dude, you shouldn't be in the middle. You should be up front. Everyone needs to hear what they did to you." Malcolm shook his head. "My father said to let time take care of things. But sometimes I think time is too slow." The lights went out. The murmuring ceased. Director Helen took the stage, a paper in her hands, her expression tense. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "We are here today to talk about responsibility, coexistence, and mutual respect." Some students snorted, others crossed their arms. The principal's own voice seemed shaky, unusual for someone who always spoke with authority. Recently, a serious misunderstanding occurred at our school. A student was wrongly accused, and after a careful review, we concluded that he is innocent. A murmur ran through the auditorium. Malcolm looked down. His heart was racing. The director continued, "I want to take this moment to reinforce that Maplewood does not tolerate discrimination of any kind." It was then that a voice emerged from the audience. "But you tolerated it before you had proof." There was immediate silence. Everyone turned around. It was Ethan Miller, the boy in the video, standing, visibly nervous. "You suspended him just because you believed what you wanted to believe. If it were any other student, you would have expected an investigation." The director froze. "Mr. Miller, please sit down." "No," Ethan replied, his voice breaking. "I made a mistake too. I knew the video didn't show him clearly, but I let everyone believe it was Malcolm. I wanted them to believe it, because I didn't like him." The auditorium was shocked. Students looked at each other, mouths agape. Malcolm stared at him, surprised. Ethan took a deep breath and continued, "I let prejudice get the better of me. I wanted to see him punished just because he's different from me. And now, I hate myself for it." The words hung heavy in the air like stones. The principal lowered her head in shame. Robert Davis, sitting in the back row, watched silently. He knew this moment was more precious than any court case. Helen tried to regain control. "Ethan, I appreciate your honesty, but—" He interrupted her. "No, Director. You don't understand. It wasn't just my mistake. It was everyone's who remained silent, including you." A chorus of murmurs filled the audience. For the first time, the woman who ruled the school with an iron fist was vulnerable, exposed. Malcolm stood up. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady. "Ethan." The boy turned around, startled. "I forgive you." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of the auditorium's breathing was audible. "But not because it was easy," Malcolm continued. "It's because hate only prolongs the pain. I don't want to carry that around with me." Ethan, his eyes watering, just nodded. The director, now without the strength to maintain her posture, murmured, "I need to apologize too. To all of you. But especially to you, Malcolm." He looked at her in silence for a few seconds and replied, "Your mistake taught me more than any class in this school. I hope no other student ever has to go through the same thing again." The applause started slowly, then grew louder. Teachers, students, and even staff members stood up. It wasn't a show of applause, it was one of respect. Robert watched his son stand there, his gaze steady, his face serene. He felt his heart swell with silent pride. From the stage, Director Helen wiped away tears. The truth had won, but not through the force of anger. It won through the calmness of someone who knew that time and dignity always reveal what is right. After that assembly, Maplewood Academy never sounded the same again. The hallways, once filled with whispers and sidelong glances, now echoed with respect. Students discussed what they had seen, not with derision, but with reflection. Malcolm's speech and Ethan's courage had become hallmarks. For the first time, everyone saw that the perfect school hid deep flaws, and that the true lesson came not from books, but from the humanity each person chose to carry. In the following days, the video of the assembly circulated on the school's social media. Someone had filmed the whole thing, the moment Ethan admitted his mistake, the tense silence, and Malcolm's "I forgive you" speech. Within hours, the footage had spread beyond Maplewood's walls. Parents began commenting, teachers from other schools shared it, and even local newspapers published the story under the headline, "Wrongly Accused Student Teaches Empathy at Elite School." The impact was enormous. In a world accustomed to stories of conflict, seeing a teenager respond to injustice with forgiveness was deeply moving. Social media flooded with messages of support, and Malcolm's name became synonymous with strength and character. Meanwhile, Principal Helen Whitford struggled to cope with the fallout. The school board called a special meeting to review her conduct. For days, she remained reclusive, avoiding the hallways. There was no longer the same authority in the footsteps that once silenced the students. Now, even the sound of her heels echoed differently, softer but also more uncertain. At home, Malcolm watched everything cautiously. His father, Robert Davis, was watching the report on TV and commented, "Do you understand now why I said that the truth always finds its way?" Malcolm smiled. "I understand, Dad, but I didn't think she'd walk so fast." Robert replied with a calm look. "It is the power of those who speak from the heart." The next day, when Malcolm arrived at school, something surprised him. As he entered the courtyard, he saw that the main mural was covered with posters made by the students. "Justice has no color. Respect is the voice that silences prejudice." "Thank you, Malcolm." He paused, unsure of what to say. Aisha, a classmate who had always been discreetly supportive, approached, smiling. "Now everyone understands what you've always been. An example." Malcolm smiled, not proudly, but gratefully. "I just did what anyone should do." "No, Malcolm. You did what few would dare." During class, Professor Adams took the opportunity to speak to the class. "Sometimes we think we learn history only by reading about the past. But history is also made when we choose what to do about the injustice before us. Malcolm, today you wrote one of the most important pages of this school." The applause that followed was unlike any other. It was genuine, without forced noise, full of quiet respect. Malcolm looked around and noticed that, finally, the looks had changed. No longer one of suspicion, but of admiration. The following week, the Maplewood Board announced an unprecedented change. A new inclusion and equity program would be implemented, with lectures and training for all teachers and students. Malcolm's father was invited to attend the opening. When he took the stage, Robert looked at the audience and said, "The mistake isn't falling into the trap of prejudice. It's continuing to do so when you already know the truth. My hope is that this school, which once wrongly accused my son, will become an example of how forgiveness can be the greatest force in education." Applause filled the auditorium. Principal Helen, seated in the front row, couldn't hold back her tears. For the first time, she lowered her head, not out of shame, but out of sincere remorse. After the ceremony, she approached Malcolm and her father. "Davis," he said, his voice breaking, "there is no sufficient excuse for what happened. But I want to thank you for not retaliating with hatred. What you and your son did changed the school. Robert put his hand on her shoulder and replied, "What changes the world, Director, is not guilt. It is repentance transformed into action." As the sun streamed through the auditorium windows, Malcolm realized that the justice he sought lay not just in proving his innocence, but in inspiring real change. Prejudice had tried to silence him, but he responded with something no power could contain: dignity. And that was the day Maplewood Academy stopped being just an elite school. It became, for the first time, a real school. Time began to drag slowly after the assembly and the repercussions. Although justice had been served, Malcolm Davis, he still felt something heavy inside him. It wasn't anger nor shame. It was a kind of silence that was hard to explain. The school had changed. The looks on his face had changed. But he knew that some wounds took longer to heal than others. In the hallways of Maplewood, the days seemed calmer. Students now greeted Malcolm with respect, some even apologizing for what they said or believed. He responded with a small smile, but his heart wasn't filled with joy. Forgiveness, he realized, isn't easy. It's a choice. That must be made every day, especially when the memory of the pain insists on returning. One afternoon during lunch, Ethan Miller approached his table. The cafeteria fell silent. Everyone watched. Ethan held a tray, his eyes nervous. "Can I sit here?" Malcolm nodded. The two were silent for a few seconds until Ethan spoke. "I still don't know how to face you. What I did was unforgivable." Malcolm looked at him, serious but calm. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, Ethan. It just stops it from hurting me anymore." Ethan swallowed hard. "You should hate me." "I once hated," Malcolm replied, "but I discovered that hate is the punishment of the one who feels it, not the one who receives it." The words hung in the air. Ethan lowered his head, and for the first time since the beginning of everything, he cried. "I was a coward. I wanted to hurt you because I felt threatened. You were always better at everything, and I wanted to see you fall." Malcolm sighed. "So I hope. Now you understand what it's like to be on the other side." They stood there for a while in silence as the buzz slowly returned to the cafeteria. Little by little, the heavy atmosphere dissipated. There was no friendship yet, but there was understanding, the first step toward it. Later in the library, Malcolm encountered Principal Helen Whitford. She was alone, leafing through a report. When she saw him, she immediately stood up. "Malcolm, I still feel ashamed. I wronged you." He took a deep breath. Yes, he was wrong, but he taught me something important. What? That the power to judge someone comes with the responsibility to know the truth, and that when this responsibility is forgotten, injustice is born. Helen was silent, visibly touched. "You are much more mature than many adults I know." Malcolm smiled slightly. "I had good examples at home." As he left the library, the cool late afternoon breeze enveloped him. He walked to the school's bulletin board, now a symbol of Maplewood's new era. Among the messages of support was a new one. Forgiveness isn't forgetting what someone did. It's remembering without letting it destroy you. He paused for a few seconds before the sentence. It was exactly what he felt. Forgiveness wasn't an end point, but a new beginning. That night at home, his father was waiting for him on the porch. Robert Davis sat quietly with a cup of coffee. "How was your day, son?" "Strange. People treat me differently now, with a respect, but I don't know if I deserve it." Robert looked at him tenderly. "You didn't earn respect by beating an impeachment, Malcolm. You earned it by showing character when the world expected you to hate." Malcolm was silent, absorbing every word. His father continued. "People remember injustice, but it's forgiveness that changes history. When you chose to forgive, you didn't just free others, you freed yourself." Those words echoed in his mind until he fell asleep. The next day, as he walked around school, he noticed something different in people's eyes. It wasn't pity nor guilt. It was genuine respect. For the first time, he felt proud of who he was. Not for having been a victim, but for having been strong enough not to let it define him. And as the sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the main hallway, Malcolm understood what his father meant. Forgiveness, though burdensome, is the most powerful form of justice. Time passed, and Maplewood Academy began to breathe a new life. That episode that had once shamed the school had become a turning point. Classrooms took on a more human tone, teachers began to listen to their students more, and the discourse on equality and coexistence was no longer just a pretty poster on the wall. It was now part of everyday life. But no one felt this transformation more deeply than Helen Whitford, the director. Since the assembly, something inside her had broken. The rigid woman, accustomed to seeing everything in black and white, now saw the nuances, and in them discovered the weight of her own prejudices. One morning, Helen arrived at school before everyone else. The sun was still rising behind the main building, and the silence in the hallways reminded her of the day she suspended Malcolm. He walked to the room where the meeting had been held. There was the same chair, the same table, but everything seemed smaller. She sat down, took a deep breath, and stared into the void ahead. For a moment, he felt ashamed. But soon after, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: true regret. Hours later, during the weekly administrative meeting, she surprised the coordinators. "Gentlemen, starting today, I want to propose something new. No student will be suspended or punished until we hear all sides." Not one. The teachers looked at each other. One of them asked, "Are you referring to Mr. Davis's case?" Helen nodded. "Yes, and I hope it never happens again." The silence in the room was one of respect. Everyone knew those words were the result of a weight the director carried. In the following days, Helen began visiting classrooms. She talked to students, listened to their stories, and asked about their difficulties. Her stern look gave way to a more approachable human expression. During one of these visits, she stopped by Malcolm's class. The conversation was about ethics and responsibility. The teacher, upon seeing her, offered to speak. She hesitated for a second, but then said, "You've learned in recent months how much the truth can be distorted. But the hardest part of all this is realizing when the error lies within ourselves." He looked directly at Malcolm. "I was wrong, and there's no justification that can erase the damage I caused. But I want you to know that I learned from it. Prejudice isn't always blatant. Sometimes it hides behind haste, indifference, and the belief that we know who the other person is." The room fell silent. Malcolm watched her calmly. There was no anger in his gaze, only understanding. "You've changed," he said calmly. Helen took a deep breath. "I needed to fall to learn to get up with humility." After class, she called him to talk on the way out. "Malcolm," he said, his voice softer than ever, "I want to thank you, not only for forgiving me, but for showing me something I couldn't see. You changed this school, and you changed me along with it." He smiled. "You taught me what happens when power meets repentance. And sometimes, that's what the world needs to see." That night, Helen returned home a different person. For the first time, she sat at her desk without opening her reports, without thinking about numbers or notes. She wrote a letter she planned to keep as a memento. "Dear Malcolm, the day I accused you was the worst of my career, and perhaps the most important, because that was the day I stopped believing that my authority made me righteous. You taught me that forgiveness is more powerful than any punishment. Thank you for letting me learn, when I only deserve to be remembered for my mistakes." He folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer. As he turned off the lights in his office, he realized that the silent school now had another sound. The sound of change. And for the first time, Helen Whitford slept peacefully, knowing that her mistake had created something bigger: conscience. When it seemed like the storm had finally passed, life decided to prove that there is always room for another twist. It was a cold Thursday afternoon when Robert Davis Malcolm's father received an unexpected call from the regional school board. The voice on the other end was formal, but there was tension beneath the lines. "Mr. Davis, we are aware of the incident at Maplewood Academy. Ms. Helen Whitford submitted a report admitting her wrongdoing and recommending a review of all disciplinary protocols. We would like you to meet with us as a consultant." Robert remained silent. For a few seconds, surprised. "Consultant?" He, who had been treated like an indignant father, was now being asked to help the very system that had hurt him. The next day, when he arrived at school, he was greeted in a completely different way. Teachers greeted him respectfully. Staff smiled discreetly. Principal Helen was waiting for him at the door of his classroom, standing. "Mr. Davis," she said, her tone humble, "I asked the regional board to invite you. None of us here understands better what it means to suffer injustice and still respond with dignity. And we need that vision." Robert nodded silently. There was something sincere in her voice. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for transformation. "Principal," he replied, "you don't change a school with excuses. You change it with action, and I'm willing to help, as long as everyone is willing to listen." Over the next few weeks, Robert lectured on institutional ethics and unconscious bias, speaking to teachers, coordinators, and even parents. "Prejudice is rarely spoken out," he said at one of the meetings. "It manifests itself in hasty decisions, in doubtful looks, in voices that don't listen. And that's why we need to talk about it, so our children don't have to go through what mine did." The audience listened in absolute silence. Each word was an open wound finally being healed. Meanwhile, Malcolm watched his father with growing admiration. Seeing this man, steady and serene, transform pain into learning inspired him. At home, over dinner, he commented, "Father, I used to think justice was about punishing those who made mistakes, but now I see it's about teaching those who haven't learned yet." Robert smiled proudly. "Exactly, son. Punishment corrects. Justice transforms." A few days later, the school organized a big event, Awareness and Diversity Week, led by Robert and supported by students, including Malcolm and Ethan. Principal Helen opened the event with an emotional speech. "Maplewood was once known for discipline. Today, we want to be remembered for empathy. This change began with a mistake and with the courage of a father who made us look at ourselves." The audience applauded. When Robert took the stage, he looked out at the packed auditorium and said, "Many people ask me if I didn't want to sue the school. The truth is, I wanted something bigger, because a lawsuit ends with a sentence. But change begins with a conversation, and that's what my son and I came here to do. Talk." Malcolm, sitting in the front row, smiled. He applauded his father with pride, knowing that this moment wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced. At the end of the ceremony, Helen approached again. "Mr. Davis," he said sincerely, "you not only cleared your son's name, you cleared the school's name as well." Robert looked at her and replied calmly, "No, Principal. It was his forgiveness that cleared the school's name." The light slowly dimmed as the students filed out of the auditorium. Outside, the wind blew lightly, and the Maplewood flag fluttered in the dusk. It was no longer a symbol of authority. Now it was the silent reminder that power without empathy is just vanity. And in that instant, Robert Davis understood that karma had not come to collect anything. It had come correct what was wrong. Months had passed since the chaos that shook Maplewood Academy to its foundations. Winter had given way to spring, and the campus was, blooming, not just in the trees but in the people. The light wind carried heartfelt laughter, and the hallways, once cold and impersonal, now vibrated with life. For the first time in decades, the school breathed humanity. The transformation was visible. The diversity program implemented by Robert Davis had become part of the routine. Lectures, discussion groups, and interdisciplinary projects gave a voice to students who had previously gone unnoticed. Differences in color, origin, and creed were no longer a source of tension, but a source of learning. On one of the main murals, there was now a new sign. Justice is not just about righting wrongs, but to ensure that what is right is never forgotten. Malcolm passed by it every day, and every time he read those words, he was reminded of how much the suffering he had experienced had become a seed. One day, Professor Adams called him after class. "Malcolm, the school board has approved a new initiative. We want to name the main library after a student who symbolizes the school's spirit of resilience and ethics, and the name chosen was yours." Malcolm was stunned into silence. I I don't know what to say. Just say you accept. You deserve it. At the opening ceremony, the auditorium was packed. Parents, students, and teachers gathered to celebrate. Helen Whitford, now lighter and with a genuine smile, took the stage. Today, we honor a student who showed us that character is stronger than injustice, that forgiveness is more powerful than anger, and that a true leader is one who transforms pain into hope. Welcome to the Malcolm Davis Library. The audience gave a standing ovation. Malcolm walked onto the stage, his father at his side. As he took the microphone, he took a deep breath before speaking. One day, I entered this school believing I needed to be perfect to be respected. Today, I know that respect comes from being honest. What happened to me wasn't just a lesson. It was a reminder that, we all have the power to change, even those who make mistakes. His words echoed through the auditorium. Helen, overcome with emotion, discreetly wiped away her tears. Robert, his gaze firm and proud, watched silently, like a father who knew his mission had been accomplished. After the ceremony, while everyone was taking pictures, Helen approached Robert. I never imagined that this school would have a student's name on the walls. Robert smiled. His name represents what she learned. Helen looked at the newly revealed sign and replied, and what she can never forget. Outside, the sun was slowly setting over the campus, casting the building in golden hues. The windows reflected the soft afternoon glow, and for a moment, everything seemed in perfect harmony. Malcolm watched the students pass by, each with their own story, their own differences, their own struggles, and he realized that the world doesn't change with speeches. It changes with examples. Maplewood Academy had ceased to be a school of walls and rules. It was now a symbol of empathy, rebirth, and justice. And the boy who was once unfairly suspended was now remembered as the student who taught the entire school what humanity means. Time, as always, played its part. Months turned into years, and Malcolm Davis's story became a living part of the city's identity. Maplewood Academy. New students heard his name from the very first days of class, as if he were a legend. Not that of a boy who had been wronged, but that of someone who had the courage to transform his own suffering into something greater. The library that bore his name became the heart of the school. Inside, on the wood-paneled walls, a quote was engraved in gold letters. The truth may be silent, but it is never silent. The phrase had become a motto. Professors quoted it in speeches, students wrote it on papers, and visitors often stopped to take photos. There was something there that transcended time, a reminder that power lies not in institutions, but in the people who have the courage to do what is right. Malcolm, now a graduate, returned to the school 3 years later for the graduation ceremony. He looked different, more mature, more confident, but his eyes still held the same calm glow. As soon as he entered the main gate, he was greeted by admiring glances and heartfelt hugs. Many of the new students recognized him from reports and lectures he had given on ethics and resilience. On stage, alongside Director Helen and his father Robert, Malcolm was invited to speak. The auditorium was packed. The silence that preceded his speech was almost solemn. When I left Maplewood, I thought I had closed a chapter in my life, he began. But I learned that justice doesn't end when wrongs are righted. It begins when truth creates change. And that's what this school did. He paused, looking at the students in the front rows. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's this. Never let fear silence your voice. Silence in the face of injustice is the soil in which prejudice grows. Principal Helen watched him with emotion, her face serene. To her, this young man was a constant reminder that even those who make mistakes can learn. Robert, hands clasped, watched his son with silent pride. Malcolm continued, "Some of you may experience situations where the world seems against you. In those times, remember, character is the only thing no one can take away. It is the shield that resists lies and, the beacon that guides the truth." The applause began slowly, and within seconds, filled the entire hall. Teachers, students, and parents rose to their feet. The sound of applause echoed off the high ceiling, mingling with the distant sound of wind blowing through the open windows. After the ceremony, Helen approached. "Malcolm, if I could go back in time, I would do everything differently." He smiled. "If I had, perhaps none of this would exist. Sometimes mistakes are the only path to consciousness." The two embraced. It was brief, but filled with meaning, the kind of gesture that doesn't apologize, just seals it. Outside, Malcolm's father was waiting for him under the tree where, years ago, they used to talk after school. "You spoke like a man today," said Robert, smiling. "I learned from the best," replied the son. They stood there in silence, watching the students file out. The sunset was painting the campus golden, and the sign, Malcolm Davis Library, reflected the light as if it shone on its own. Robert put his hand on his son's shoulder and said, "Do you understand now what karma wanted to teach you?" Malcolm looked at the horizon and replied, "I understand, Father. Karma didn't come to punish me. It came to prepare me." They both smiled, at peace. The wind blew softly, as if Maplewood itself was breathing alongside them, and in that moment, the past, the present, and the future seemed to meet, united by a lesson that would never be forgotten. The sun was rising lazily over the city when Malcolm Davis. He got up that Saturday. The day was special. Maplewood Academy was celebrating its centenary, and he had been invited as an honorary alumnus to close the celebratory ceremony. As he walked through the quiet streets, the young man felt something different, a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. Years had passed since the life-changing event, but the memories were still vivid. He remembered the pain, the fear, the silence of injustice, but also the forgiveness, the learning, and the strength that emerged afterward. When he arrived at the school, the main gate was decorated with banners and flowers. Children ran through the gardens, retired teachers reunited, and laughter filled the place that had once been the scene of tears. Maplewood was unrecognizable, not because the walls had changed, but because people had learned to see each other with their hearts. Director Helen Whitford, now retired, waited in the entrance. Her hair, once stiff and tied back, was now loose. There was a lightness in her expression. "Malcolm," she said, smiling, "I thought you wouldn't come." "I wouldn't miss it for anything, Director." "Former Director," she corrected with a gentle laugh. "Today I'm just Helen." They walked together through the courtyard. The sign Malcolm Davis Library glistened in the morning light, and he remembered the day that sign had been put up. "You know," Helen said, "for a long time I thought being a director meant always being right. But you were the one who taught me that leading is listening." Malcolm smiled. "And it was you who taught me that even those who make mistakes can change." Soon after, the auditorium was packed. Hundreds of people awaited the closing address. Among the audience were Robert Davis, the proud father who now smiled more with his eyes than with words, and several students who had entered the school inspired by his story. When Malcolm took the stage, the applause was deafening. He waited for silence to return, and then began. "I was born believing the world was fair. Later I discovered it wasn't. But what I experienced here, at this school, showed me something more important, that the world can become fair if each of us decides to be part of the change." He looked out at the audience, the lights reflecting off his face. Justice doesn't need a loud voice. Sometimes it manifests itself in the silence of those who don't retaliate, in the courage of those who forgive, in the humility of those who acknowledge their mistake. I was a victim of prejudice, but I left here as living proof that good doesn't need to win by force. It wins by persistence. The school camera recorded every word. Some teachers wept quietly. Helen wiped her eyes. Robert watched proudly, with the same serenity as always. Malcolm continued. "Today, when I look back, I see that what happened to me wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because every injustice we overcome becomes a bridge to those who come after. Pain taught me empathy. Forgiveness taught me peace. And life taught me that true power lies not in those who accuse, but in those who choose to continue, even when hurt." The silence that followed was deep, full of meaning. Malcolm took a deep breath and concluded, "Karma didn't come to punish me. It came to teach me to see, and what I saw changed everything." The applause was long and emotional. People stood and hugged, applauding not only the man on stage but the journey they had all witnessed. After the ceremony, Malcolm walked to the courtyard. The wind blew gently, swaying the trees and making the leaves dance in the air. He stopped before the school mural, now filled with diverse faces, diverse stories, genuine smiles, and closed his eyes. For a moment, he heard the distant echo of the past, the cold sound of injustice, the aching silence of exclusion. But then, immediately, he heard something stronger, the voice of change, whispering that nothing had been in vain. He opened his eyes, looked at the horizon, and smiled. The story was complete. True justice is born when forgiveness overcomes pride. Karma doesn't punish, it educates. And what begins with pain can end with light.